Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's super nice to be here at the Barbican, to get lost in the Barbican with you. It's also an honor to kind of speak or be part of that series, because we also admire the work of the other three offices. They're also friends of us. We also work together occasionally, so it's really nice to have that kind of circle. I'm a bit, and you too, maybe under pressure today, because actually it's our first lecture where people actually have to pay to listen to us. So I mentioned this to Phil yesterday, so I hope we're worth the money, but we'll see. We'll see, yeah? Okay. Could we tone the lights down a bit to see the slides better? And I'm a bit, I have to apologize in advance. It's going to be really a lecture, like in a sense of a lecture, like leggere, like to read, action of reading. So we're going to read a lot. Yes. So architecture used to be concerned with the creation of objects. Today we experience a fundamental shift away from the object, away from singularity, towards a transformative understanding of architecture as a tool to create relationships, complexity, and coexistence. So afterFORM is after the form, but also points out to the question of what comes next once the discipline has to let go of its classical formats. Once we are forced to expand, redefine, or blur our line of work. Once we realize that our current norms, habits, values, and forms are no longer making sense. So, and this might be like the most euphoric aspect of today, we live in a pre-normalized, pre-regulated, and pre-formalized time, which all of a sudden has to be receptive for change, for gestures of showing alternatives, for optimistic experiments, in order to provoke some sort of evolution in the best sense. So metamorphologies is an attempt to read and engage with space differently.
Metamorphologies is about how things can take shape, but also about what shapes things. Fundamentally, it is about change and transformation. The prefix meta renders morphology or form as something non-static. It indicates in-betweenness, so something that is in the process. But meta also refers to a level that goes beyond the individual happening, beyond singularity. Things and ideas that can possibly be adapted or recycled and then applied somewhere else. So we will talk about attempts and tactics on how to change, distort, and subvert our current normative understanding of the everyday and the perception of these spaces, of its spaces. When thinking about change, technological change, economic change, any change in society actually, in the 19th and 20th century, there was a working selection mechanism which allowed you to see whether something is good or bad. Good was progressive or in line with modernization. Bad was equal to regressive or archaic. So this binary modern value system, good versus bad, culture versus nature, the subject versus the object, had led us, as we all know, of course, into some very dead ends on also various levels. So right now, this testing system does not work anymore, because modernization is no longer the key to good or bad. And as Bruno Latour puts it, we don't have a testing system for the definition of techniques going in one direction or the other. For example, permaculture, which is an archaic technique, yet it is very progressive from a present point of view. It is very difficult to define a regressive or progressive direction for any technique, like innovation per se, because we can barely envision all possible and also impossible after effects and also after forms of that certain innovation. Culture staggers endlessly sideways, like a crab on LSD, as Kohlhaas would put it. Since change has been divorced from the idea of improvement. But a more positive interpretation of this could be that we understand change as a circular movement, that things appear and reappear again, which is fundamentally the principle of recycling. All knowledge is already produced. Today's time is just about its application. So in order to talk about change and judge, Instead of continuing with this modern notion of duality, we have to question every single aspect of this binary value system of good and bad, which basically means questioning the very categories and kinds that constitute this said value system. Our everyday lives and our profession as architects, of course, as well. In troubled times, our point of entry as architects is the embracing of the full complexity of what we inherit from an ending era. In our case, it's the era of clear opinions, limiting taxonomy and rigid categories. Physically, spatially, ideologically, materialistically, economically, also mentally and spiritually. Our context, let's say our complexity, is the generic Swiss city, you see it here, with its norms, standards, residential constructions, junk space, front gardens, leftover spaces, regulation, and economic realities. But when we look twice, and when we learn, or as Donna Haraway and before Hannah Arendt would put it, relearn thinking, we discover a new potential in between these binary oppositions of inside and outside, and we understand again that, quote, we have never been modern.
If your wife is unfaithful, how can you ever be sure that the child is really yours? My belly aches again. I eat only fruit, giving up meat. Is that wise?
Signore e signori, ospiti illustri.
Respirez, respirez à fond. Je ne vois pas ce qu'ont les gens, ils ne respirent pas.
So in this trailer, we try to rethink the relationship between the house and the city, inside and outside, architecture and landscape, and proposed an architecture of joining which goes beyond perimeter lines, beyond the object. Yet the contemporary Swiss city and its architecture is composed of these singular objects. So no more monuments, no more axes, no more symmetries, no continuum, but instead fragmentation, parcelization, privatization, and atomization. Today it seems that the only certainty is narrowed down to a single point, the singular house as an object and the rooms within. In this context, it is interesting to look at the writing of Georges Perec. I don't know if you're familiar with his writing, but he manages to reveal a kind of freedom within the boredom of our everyday spaces. And it's interesting how he manages basically to reverse the crisis of determinism. In Espèce d'Espace, Perec shows, and that's like 50 years ago, the degree of opacity our everyday life has on spaces, how our ever-repeating actions actually disguise the space in which they take place and how everyday life acts as a form of anesthesia. So he's kind of writing, la mère se lève et va préparer le petit déjeuner dans la cuisine, l'enfant se lève et va dans la salle de bain, and so on and so on. So the ever repeating same actions happen in these spaces which are mere backgrounds of our everyday life. But then he goes on in the next pages and starts to set these species, how he calls it, species of spaces, espèces, in relation to each other. He, for example, describes the kinship of the broom closet with the living room, saying like, in the broom closet we put the vacuum cleaner, and in the living room we put our exhausted bodies. So both spaces refer to the same notion of recovery and maintenance. By looking for similarities, suddenly rooms start to change their meaning because we change the way we look at them. So by describing and relating these mostly very boring spaces, Perec also starts to deform them and introduces a possible transformation. So the way we describe things or the way we depict things obviously changes the way we understand them and has the power to actually change reality, to create relationships and proximities where there were none before. All of a sudden, we could draw a line between two different species or two different species of spaces, as it is the case on the right here in Colin Rowe's analysis of the ideal villa relating Le Corbusier to the architecture of Palladio. And we kind of recognize one as the metamorphosis of the other. Through morphing on the left, this is Darcy Thompson on growth and form, and transcription on the right, traditional components can be dismantled. Common features can be discovered which are below the surface of their appearance, and traditional meaning, as it is the case in Moretti's studies of spaces and sequences. So Moretti not only translates the spatial sequence of the Palazzo Thiene by Palladio into a mathematical kind of Euclidean geometry, but also is liberating space from meaning, from its cultural context, from its style. He treats spaces as containers that can possibly act like anagrams, which can host different programs and narratives. I don't know if you're familiar with this word anagram. It's, let's say, the recomposition of letters within a word that can form different words. So heart is like earth, or dog is God. And if a space is a container, it can also host different compositions. That is what allows you kind of to use spaces of palazzi as a tool and to learn from them. So he kind of reveals, Moretti in these studies, a kind of meta quality of these spaces. And of course we could, like this word or this, topic of metamorphology, we could, as the evolution of form and figure, understand it as something inherently kind of present within the architectural process of building and constructing. So because we change matter, we demolish, we manipulate, we distort. All of it is physical. It is transformation of tangible matter. But sometimes these physical manipulations, they're fantastic because they are super illusionary and because they cannot be understood at the glance. So they don't act like billboards. This is how Bernard Tschumi puts it, like if you can see a building and understand it at once. So it's basically not spatial. So this is the smile. What you see is the smile of Ramses in Luxor, which is only perceived as a smile once you kind of elevate yourself and place your head at the same elevation as the head of Ramses. Viewed from the ground level far below, this smile appears as a straight line due to perspective distortion. So the pharaoh had to smile in order not to smile. And that's also what the Greeks use with the columns, entasis it's called. So you would have to kind of distort perfection of the column to kind of make them appear perfect. Yet the perception of our physical landscape remains to be not only a visual construct, but first and foremost kind of a mental construct, as Lucius Burckhardt puts it. On the left you see a Hodler painting, one of those illustrations that tremendously shaped the way we look at the Swiss landscape, and also the tendency, we have also the tendency to romanticize it. On the right side you see an actual landscape, physical one, and physically signed by the artist Hamilton Finley with a F. Hodler. So this is kind of a minimal intervention and it fundamentally changes the way this landscape is being perceived. So the signature appropriates basically the view and elevates its meaning to kind of a sublime level. What we see and what we experience is not an environmental phenomena, but rather happening in the mind's eye of those doing the looking. So seeing is basically a normative process. We see in patterns. This is for an easier understanding. We learn from things we saw before and memorize it from the past. So the past basically constantly helps us to decipher the present. This is kind of a loop of knowledge, let's say. And we can manipulate that loop, or we can sabotage its pattern. And this is basically what politicians do. This is what celebrities do. This is what advertisement does, and so on. They change the way we look at the world, and therefore they change the world. And you have to remember, this operation basically does not have a footprint yet. So if our perception of landscape is a construct, we as architects should also be able to reconstruct that very perception of landscape. So when we had the chance to do a project for the Biennale del Territorio in Lugano, we decided not to build something on the premises of the Biennale, which was kind of a villa on the park, but instead to expand the perimeter of the Biennale into the city and try to create different realities without physically changing the urban space. Actually, we only changed the sound of that space. So we invited visitors of the Biennale on a cinematic tour, that's how we called it, around the city, which works like a movie, except that the images are not moving, but the spectator. So through stories, sounds, excerpts from lectures or books, audio snippets from movies, we created alternative narratives of different existing locations and spaces in the city of Lugano. So for example, a postmodern square with a step topography, some benches and staircases became a possible skate park. Leftover spaces became art pieces of Gordon Mother Clark. The university, a place for protest and change, social change. The car park, a crime scene, and so on. So what was interesting and also kind of a powerful experience was that through the different narratives and sounds, which sometimes refer to the history of a place, sometimes just related to a specific place in terms of its spatial qualities, we could compress time and space, literally. One could, in a way, experience the past and the present at the same time. We could reenact things, or we could make two locations present in one singular space. So in one scene, for example, we managed to kind of change the location of a place and kind of move it closer to the water, even though the location was, through the narrative, miles away from the lake of Lugano. We could amplify the potential of existing spaces. For example, when you hear like Jane Jacobs talking about the importance of a street corner while literally standing on a street corner. So by kind of this is kind of augmented reality, I think, in a way, and that through staged sound, we created kind of a physical elsewhere, a place that appeared that night and might disappear.
I'm just interested to see how narrative creates a physical, natural, new territory, an elsewhere. This is an elsewhere. It's not so much Antarctica, which is an elsewhere. This place is an elsewhere. This place appear and might disappear. I'm very interested about this fragility, this intermittence.
On the one hand, it's connected with an idea of truth. On the other hand, it's connected with an idea of invention, imagination, lies. The imagination runs riot.
Intervenuti sul posto abbiamo chiesto in un primo momento di spegnere la musica, questo non è successo, quindi siamo intervenuti sul generatore, questo ha scatenato la reazione dei presenti. Abbiamo utilizzato in un primo momento lo spray urticante per cercare di separare appunto gli agenti.
Nestled in the sunny mountains near the southernmost tip of Switzerland is Lugano, city of beauty. Located on Lake Lugano, the city is surrounded by some of the most picturesque villages in southern Europe. warmed by the brilliant sun, and the visitor may decide to spend hours in this one spot, enjoying the wonders of the Swiss landscape.
Finding space has become more and more difficult, especially green space, space for recreation, and space for play. Now, often the space that does exist is leftover space, small spaces, between buildings, behind shops. It's often in-between space, useless space that only exists as a consequence of a number of useful spaces that come together.
The first thing really to understand about skate parks is they're not sports facilities. Nobody here is winning, nobody is trying to beat each other. And they're really community spaces where people come and hang out, challenge themselves, be with their friends. They're places where people of all ages, different backgrounds come together. And in my mind, they're one of the world's great kinds of public space.
Today's streets are planned and furnished primarily with cars in mind. Their significance as communicative interfaces for people is successively diminishing. Efficiency and security are increasingly supplanting the multifunctionality of streets in terms of the mixed use, collective use. This applies just as much to pedestrian zones tailored to consumerism as it does to the economically oriented transformation of urban spaces to accommodate moving and stationary traffic. The street, however, is always also a place for political and cultural demonstrations, a place where conflicts are negotiated and power structures are put in the spotlight.
A majority begin to desire a radical change in the university. A minority begin to agitate for a radical change in society.
Stasera ti prego, via mio figlio che vada a dormire, perché le cose che io ho da dire non sono cose che deve sentire. Dopo stamane là sul lavoro con il sorriso.
Current urban economy would probably lead to the replacement of this very structure with profitable residential or office buildings. But maybe its programmatic obsolescence might offer the chance for an overturn in the tragedy of commons. The built infrastructure of the multi-story car park as a gigantic maison domino fulfills the modern dream of continuous generic space.
So we actually tested this hypothesis in Zurich and tried to consider the parking as architecture of social existence and not only as a problem of storage, what it is right now. It's a quite pressing topic. Zurich, like many other cities, is facing some kind of an inverted traffic problem. Today's changes are not caused by bringing cars into the city, but rather by getting them out of the city. This is the 70s, when highways were supposed to run into, across, and through cities. The speed of the car compressed time and space, expanded the notion of the city, and propelled the idea of a life beyond spatial limits. In case you remember this quote by Le Corbusier, "Cities will be part of the country. I shall live 30 miles from my office in one direction, under a pine tree. My secretary will live 30 miles away from it in the opposite direction, under another pine tree. We shall both have our own car. We shall use up trees, wear out road surfaces and gears, consume oil and gasoline, all of which will necessitate a great deal of work, enough for all." And you see, speed takes away meaning from a place. You simply don't have to deal with it anymore. The image on the left captures a protest against the construction of a gigantic traffic infrastructure, such as the Y project seen on the right, that would immediately lead to the demolishing of many houses and the displacement, of course, of the less wealthy people. It was also the first time squatting occurred as a practical strategy against the housing shortage and high rents in Zurich. Still today, traffic projects cause the biggest social changes within the city. This is an image taken in 2015 during a Reclaim the Streets event in Zurich. Even though today it is about pedestrian zones and Tempo 30 roads, on a meta level, both ideologies, the celebration of the car, as it was the case in the 70s, and also its disappearance today, result in segregation, demolition, and displacement. Ironically, they have more or less the same impact. And it's true. The disappearance of the car comes with a reversed image of the city as well. There is a drastic shift happening towards a nice, soft, green, and user-friendly image. As the city becomes more safe and comfortable, the last spark of a maybe a bit dirty, adventurous urbanism seems to vanish. And as Rem Koolhaas says it, a new universal trinity is shaping the urban space: comfort, security, and sustainability. This new trinity produces a highly controlled, also flattened and exclusive environment in terms of who is using the space and what it is being used for. In other words, when it comes to gentrification, traffic always plays a decisive role. One example of radical social change happened in this street you see here. From 2007 onwards, the Weststraße, formerly known as the nation's exhaust, became a neighborhood street with a 30 kilometers per hour speed limit. Where once huge trucks were crossing the city, there is now a low traffic area, mostly used for pedestrians and cyclists. Of course, not only the speed of the vehicles has changed, but also the renters, the size of the apartments, and their newly renovated facades. However, slowing down the tempo resulted in a kind of high-speed gentrification. Where once a lot of people with diverse cultural backgrounds lived on a few square meters, is now home to fewer people with much more similar backgrounds and also bigger apartments. As the paradigm shifted from the city of high speeds and long ways to the city of short distances and high accessibility, we are not only confronted with a kind of brutal beautification, so, I mean, beauty never comes without a price, but also with a new type of ruin, the parking garage. And it's precisely that typology which is completely opposed to the soft image of the city. Parkings are basically the evil twin of comfort. Its downside. They're cold and bleak and don't fit the green, child-friendly new image of cities. They're non-places, places without a self, as Sloterdijk says. One never goes to the parking in order to go to the parking. You use the parking only to go somewhere else, to go shopping, to go to the theater, and so on. But isn't it like mental absence, its rejection within the social life of the city and its spatial genericness, precisely its potential? In the slipstream of an ongoing moral purification and politically correct curation of urban space, the parking garage could become a place of true freedom, its genericness an endless testing field for different configurations. The parkings of Zurich could constitute a turning point in the tragedy of the commons. As a spatial continuum that is accessible by large ramps, the parkings are part of the street space and could also become part of the urban landscape, almost as like a piece of infrastructure or topography. As we heard before, like a gigantic maison domino, the parking garage even fulfills the idea of the promenade architecturale. As built infrastructure, these open structures contain a huge potential for the city. Like the Fun Palace, the parking could host programs which would otherwise be hard to realize in the city and could even trigger social change. Temporary uses, art spaces, uses in the intermediate climate that just need a sheltering roof, and so forth. And of course, alternative forms of dwelling and working. As a first attempt to test such an alternative program and to rethink those existing surfaces, we turned a parking in the western part of Zurich into domestic landscape. For one moment, This was probably the most radical and maybe also the most archaic apartment in Zurich.
So architecture may have started out as a shelter, but it can also be a trap. Still today, the dream of almost every Swiss middle-class family is to live in a single-family house. I think currently like a third of all people in Switzerland live in single-family households. It's this very type of housing that you see here in this kind of slightly altered image, mostly in the form of terraced houses that is still being reproduced. Even though this is not LA, it's Baden, it's a small city kind of close to Zurich, and it's not the 1960s anymore, but the here and now. Economically, the terrace house embodies a kind of win-win situation. The investor gets to build the maximum of surface on a complicated site, yet you give the inhabitants the illusion to be completely alone on the parcel. The perversity of a kind of Caspar David Friedrich painting or attitude combined with the capitalist mindset of the investor that wants to maximize profit. Also legally, the one-family house is kind of considered as almost like a basic right in Switzerland. A couple of years ago, Jacqueline Badran, it's a leftist politician we admire a lot, tried to strengthen the Lex Kohler. It's a law which says that no foreigners could buy property. It's not against foreigners, but against the fact that the property price would rise a lot. She was put down, turned down several times over several years. And then, kind of only now that land prices are super high and rising excessively, the right-wing politicians picked up on that initiative because they are afraid that the Swiss middle-class family couldn't afford to buy a house anymore. So this is kind of ironic, but this happens. So it's really a piece of protection, this typology. And anyway, because of the topography of Baden, these hills around Baden, Baden is surrounded, literally, by this kind of housing typology. Even though today the terrace house stands on shaky grounds and on an even larger ecological footprint. It is an inside-out building type, par excellence. The kind of building you want to maybe inhabit, that you maybe love from the inside, but definitely hate when you happen to be outside of the building. So eventually the city of Baden and also the villages around, they kind of started to protest against the terrace house. There was even an attempt by the kind of local council to illegalize this type of housing. This is actually the place I grew up. I'm kind of glad that our house is not on there. It's on the left, on the right, but this is how it looks right now, these hills. So on a certain point, we had the opportunity to design a temporary pavilion, a restaurant, a bar for a festival, for the Festival of Baden, which is kind of a big thing. It's called Badenfahrt. It's one of the biggest city festivals in Switzerland. And we didn't want to build just another wooden pavilion, because this is what happens normally. We wanted to build the last terrace house of Baden, kind of a political project. So we specifically chose a site for our house, a plot which was not on the festival area, but just opposite and opposite also of the old town. It was basically the last green field around Baden, or as the investor would say, a well-accessible site with an unbeatable and unobstructable view. Before the festival started, you can see we put it the wooden poles, the so-called Baugespann. Nick, you know that type of thing. We wanted to announce it as a real kind of building project, like a permanent structure, which it wasn't, obviously. Oh, sorry, wrong direction. So what we built actually was then a prototype, a kind of mock-up of a terrace house, a kind of showcase house, which could be inhabited by the visitors. It was radically conceptualized from inside out, an inverted Potemkin village, basically. So the whole energy went to the inside of the house. Outside it looked like a construction site, something in the making. It represented construction, and at the same time it constructed, obviously, representation. The scaffolding related to the construction activities in the surrounding villages rather than the other pavilions of the festival. But everything on the inside was paper thin and ultimately temporary. It was kind of a total fake. The brick, the Leni lamp, like a classical Swiss design piece, the concrete columns, the marble kitchen. It was a house like a stage set. The chimney, of course, non-functional. The brick, just a thin layer of printed paper. Self-adhesive foil as marble. Beer mats as tiles. A kidney-shaped pool built as a space to sit in. And of course, there was a garden. I don't know if you remember the quote from Frank Lloyd Wright, like the perfect house has kind of the street in front and the forest in the back. So an enclosed space was basically our garden, but at the same time an endless forest with an emergency door exit. We used a one-to-one print of the forest nearby, so we created this illusion to sit within the trees. And that was the organization of the thing, the floor plan. The house was organized as a sequence with clear threshold between the spaces, thick thresholds, which were painted black, so that they would appear like hard cuts in a movie. And basically all the domestic fantasies could be incorporated within this single house. Completely different rooms could be put next to each other. We could literally stage different worlds. So from down, kind of the entrance as a procession along the retention wall, along the view, the empty pool. I have a pointer. The empty pool here, kidney-shaped, a lowered space. The garden here as a forest. The balcony as a classical porch, and that was the living room and the kitchen. And of course, there was kind of an exclusive view over the city for all those who made it. The difference of this house to its modernistic ancestors is that this house, through its use, was basically truly a social space. At daytime, people gathered in a quite civilized way, drinking champagne after the house tour, enjoying the view and taking some selfies, as you can see here. And then, however, the later it got, the more extroverted the selfies became. The architecture kind of propelled this playboy attitude. Anyway, every night ended up in an excessive home party, completely crashing the living room. So at the end of the festival, kind of the pavilion was totally trashed. The chimney was set on fire. The house fell into pieces, literally kind of it vanished. So this extravagant illusion turned out to be just a fleeting dream. It was maybe the only pavilion of the whole festival that was truly temporary. And this happened only two streets further in Ennetbaden, so the name Ennetbaden next to Baden, at Schlösslistrasse, 36B. The extravagant daydreams of the 50s are long gone, and one decided for a rather modest form of living. Here all damages, every scratch in the equally thin surface is instantly being repaired. But also here, something was just not right. Trapped, locked down within one's own four white plastered walls, the desire for beauty and depth arose, and also for a new wardrobe. So when we were asked to design that very wardrobe in one of the apartments during the first Corona lockdown, we immediately felt that this house and the apartment don't need another piece of furniture, but, and maybe for the first time, a real piece of architecture. So as a macroscopic intervention in the belly of this big economical investor's chunk, we tried to build its antithesis, literally a piece of perfect architecture, a piece of resistance in a formless building substance. So hidden behind two large mirrors, the wardrobe was camouflaged as a loggia. In the same way a loggia expands the urban space, our wardrobe acts as a space that opens up towards the living room and forms a kind of niche. The two open sliding doors intervene precisely with the existing apartment and reconfigure basically the space. They eliminate the dead end and the corridor, a dead end corridor and the blind entrance. So we managed to spatially transform the apartment just by adding a piece of furniture. In this sense, our intervention was basically both hyper-contextual, but also, as a loggia, completely alien to its surrounding. While the investor's apartment is determined by the ratio of usable area to floor area, the new architecture is based on the relation of the single parts to the whole. So the mathematics of the market are being replaced by the mathematics of beauty.
But to what extent is an absolute, ultimate category of beauty valid in a plural, complex present? What if beauty was not a hermetic, self-contained mathematical construct? What if the pure, perfect form is being replaced by the mixed form, the hybrid? The individual, the undivisible, is being replaced by the divisible entity, the individual. Collision, blending, and the hybrid might help us to radically adapt existing structures and to spatialize ruptures, traces, and complex framework conditions, eventually densifying the spatial experience. The present lies in the ambiguous, multi-layered space. At Findlingsweg in Derendingen, this is a really small, average kind of village in Switzerland, in between larger towns. The client, it was a young family, asked for an annex, even though the house has already been extended twice when they bought it. For 3 reasons, we refused to do that. First, there was very little money. So we figured building a new volume with excavation and foundation and structure, isolation and facade would cost way too much. Secondly, the house was surrounded by a relatively big garden, which we did not want to occupy with just another building. And then thirdly, the house interior was a real mess. However, we were still interested in this term of the annex. Not in the architectural sense of a subordinated building that stands next to the main volume, but rather in its semantic definition. The origin of the word annex comes from the Latin term annectere, or annectere, which literally means to take possession of something. This actually reverses this hierarchical understanding of main house and annex. So we figured to rather let the annex invade the house. And work on its interior. Extending in this sense means densification and reorganization of already existing surfaces and rooms, including the garden. We started to work on the connection of the individual parts of the house so that they would begin to perform together. We tried to extend them minimally only where necessary. The ambition was that by connecting existing spaces, even small interventions could have a big impact on the house and start to change its choreography. Every spatial intervention we proposed was based on a type of space that could only exist in dependency to another space. A bay window, a landing of a staircase, a dormer which cannot exist without the roof. In this model image you see how the bay window extends the living room and connects it with the garden. Also the bay window becomes then of course the threshold between inside and outside. The continuation of the staircase through the new podest as a room which would also connect to the attic. And the dormer as an extension of the roof. On the outside, these extensions or appendix appear only fragmentary, like body parts of an inner organism that burst the limitations of their container. They don't really have an own identity or facade. They merely give a glimpse of what happens inside. So that was our preliminary approach, but since there was still it was still too expensive and the budget was still too small, the proposed extensions were really pushed even more to the inside. Also, the bank wouldn't give more credit to the client because they couldn't show quantity-wise that the house gains value through our interventions. So the system is also in favor of new constructions rather than refurbishments, which is of course a large, huge problem in Switzerland. So eventually, even though the client approached us with the wish of more space, the house paradoxically became even more dense, but also more complex and ambiguous. All elements were designed for multiple use. A landing of the staircase on the first floor, for example, is also the new study room, that one here, and the connection to the attic and the connection to the kids' room, and also storage space, all at the same time. So finally the house appears much bigger than before, even though it is definitely not. The window is sitting on the outside of the facade. It extends the living room into the garden as a minimal bay window. The landing as a part of the stairs connecting the upper floor and the roof simultaneously becomes an office or study space, as I said, and also connects the kids' room. So that's this space here, and from the outside. And finally the skylight extends the room under the roof, and you see here the chimney reveals traces of the former space and the roof shape.
Sorry. So this new diversity you see in the images, this new spatial density, and the programmatic and temporal overlaps only happen behind the hedge only happen inside kind of a private property as a private matter on a private plot, so to speak. We might think the fragmentation as a consequence of the urban sprawl is a purely rural, village phenomena. But not at all. As you can see in the city, it seems the hedges are growing even higher. This is Schwammendingen. Schwammendingen is in the northern part of Zurich. It's conceived as a garden city, which is divided by a major highway. Sorry?
Who's this guy at the top?
Danny DeVito. You only would see that in a kind of cinema space when we kind of have lectures at universities. You would not see that because the resolution is so bad. But I'm happy that you got that. Danny DeVito. It's also maybe the wrong guy because he's so, you know, kind of not so tall, so you could, you know. But these guys are actually too tall, I think. Something's again wrong, huh? But yes, this is kind of a hedge that exists in Schwammendingen, in this northern part of Zurich, a gigantic one. It looks like a caricature, but it is already being built, so it's done. It's a kind of a major highway hidden behind that gigantic hedge, a camouflaged 8-meter high and almost 1 kilometer long concrete building, which was put on top of an existing highway that is trying kind of to deny its own existence through this vertical greenery. And at least you see in the image here, at least during construction, you could see how radical this new structure is. Even though, I mean, there is supposed to be a park on top later on, morphologically, this huge new building intensifies this division of Schwammendingen. And it does actually create a lot of leftover spaces. Schwammendingen is currently undergoing drastic transformations and also kind of major densifications. But future planning doesn't really solve the issue of the enclosure, which it is called, this kind of new concrete building. It doesn't really solve the issues of the enclosure and also doesn't solve the surrounding spaces, basically doesn't react to the surrounding spaces. These new buildings, which were planned in a master plan, they don't deal with this monumental linear structure. And also you could see that their height is kind of generic. The program is kind of generic. There's kind of a new level within the city, which is elevated 8 meters, but there's no reaction. There's a kind of tiny little bridge. There's random distances to that building, which is a real pity and a missed potential. And also it's weird that half of the building is always below the enclosure and only half of the building is kind of overlooking that one. However, this is how it looks in plan, right? This is the true thing this is what engineers would deal with when they kind of build it. This is showing the sheer size of that monumental concrete thing. It's the biggest overground concrete structure in Switzerland. It also shows its spatial presence, which is really something which is in denial. It is not only a border, but you could see it's also a space where cars move in, within. You can also see that there is no real beginning and no end. It's just cut like a sausage. And this is the section. What you can see is that there is kind of an actual space on top of the highway, potentially a totally new urban space. But this space, which has a very different condition than the landscape on the ground level on both sides, is driven by contemporary ideology, I guess, reflexively covered by greenery. So they call it Überland Park, the enclosure. And you maybe remember what Luigi Snozzi used to say, a true lawn reaches until the very center of the earth. And this enclosure is not at all water permeable. So we think that the specific potential of this building as a new urban space is being lost as soon as the only ambition would be its disappearance. When the only purpose of urban space is our recreation, the relaxing part of life, to which this park refers to, we are forgetting what the city at its core actually is. The city organizes functions and uses spatially. She sets places in relation to each other, transforms independent structures to a larger whole. Organizing, putting things in relation to each other also means confrontation and friction. But the more tension, the more energy, you could say. A real city needs conflicts, because in a real city, different ideas exist simultaneously next to each other. That's where a real city takes its energy from. And we think that this highway enclosure, that's why I show you all that stuff, the Einhausung, how it's called in German, could create a lot of productive chaos from this tension. It could act like a magnet and become the new centrality of Schwammendingen. Instead of dividing, it could actually be connecting the neighborhoods physically and programmatically. So in this context and reality, we have been working together with an office in Zurich, Do Studio, on a competition by the city of Zurich for the biggest school building in Switzerland. An Ersatzneubau, kind of the new school complex, was supposed to replace the existing school buildings on site. The perimeter assigned to this new school was about 100 meters away from the enclosure, from what I just showed you before. The plot of the school building was really beautiful, also because of its sheer scale. It's actually a plot, the black plot there, the black surface with the number, with the digits on it. Apart from a few older school buildings, it was quite empty, with large open lawns, old trees. And once we started to think about this new school building, we kind of soon realized that besides demolishing all the existing buildings, we would also have to fill at least half the plot with the new school program. And the other half would be determined by outdoor surfaces, basketball fields, hardcover surfaces, and so on. In other words, the whole plot would become a schoolyard and not be open to the public anymore. So we will basically lose most of its current landscape qualities. And since Schwammendingen is now being drastically densified, it loses more and more of its former character of a garden city. The figure-ground relationship is slowly being reversed. I mean, city is characterized by kind of the space between the buildings as the negative space. It's reversed in the garden city, where kind of the space as a surface flows underneath the buildings as a whole, let's say. And this is being reversed by kind of having totally different typologies now in Schwammendingen. You have like real blocks, you have high-rise buildings and so on with large footprints. Therefore, the emptiness of this existing plot, the black surface, with its unique qualities, should really even be enhanced instead of filled. But what struck us the most was the coexistence of these two major construction projects. So the largest school in Switzerland, which this school was meant to be program-wise, and the biggest concrete structure, happening without creating any synergies, as the planners would say. And both constructions were obviously totally contradictory to their formulated objectives. Even though praised as a connection and camouflaged as an 8-meter-high hatch, the highway enclosure divides Schwammendingen even more, remaining a kind of dead carcass. And according to the brief, the new school complex should strengthen the qualities of the outdoor spaces, the green spaces, while paradoxically requesting 3 times as many square meters than the existing school buildings on site. So what we did, we kind of simply switched programs. We switched their location. The black sides like these black surfaces on the drawing mark all the cities, all the parcels that are owned by the city along this enclosure. So we moved the school complex right next to the highway enclosure. We attached it to the enclosure. So that was the space where it was meant to be the school, and we kind of moved the school to here. This is the space of the enclosure here. These are all city parcels. So we kind of figured that bureaucratically, politically, it could be possible. Through this move, we could basically redefine the enclosure, not as a fake park, but as a truly urban strip. In contrast, the former schoolyard could become a vast park that could compensate for the densification of Schwammendingen, which is in full process. So this is the park. This was supposed to be a school building. The school building merges with the highway enclosure and becomes part of it. It is not an object anymore, but part of a bigger, larger infrastructure. The school could be a prototype of a new development along the enclosure. The enclosure itself becomes a strip, a kind of boulevard. And we also propose, as you can see up there and down there, a real beginning and a real end that actually connects with the existing district. That was the 1 to 500 model we had to hand in. This is kind of this holy Swiss gypsum model, which you have to hand in every competition. But funny was that the model was actually this, right? That part. That was the model that they handed out to those who did the competition. And then we had to build half of the model ourselves, because they would have to kind of, they tried to kind of have a discourse about that space, about, you know, the proposal without having all that. What you see here is all development according to the master plan. And then during the conversation we got, because they are never really public, these talks the jury has, but we then got later on that the jury actually used our part of the model every time they discussed the proposal for here, to kind of have that as a context, which is kind of necessary, even, you know, also without the proposal. Nevertheless, so it's weird because in a way it also shows that you would have to deny complexity in order to maintain an existing order, instead of embracing that. So because of the different levels, these levels of kind of the village, it seems like a village, kind of the district and the new level above ground, we were mainly working in section for the school building. And the whole building was about connections. As I said, the building is a piece of infrastructure which would physically become part of the strip, linking the different levels. Programmatically, we even densified the school with diverse public programs and the housing slab on top. It became a kind of more hybrid, also more public building. And you could walk through the whole building, staying in the outside climate, still being part of the city, part of the strip. Not so, I mean, kind of familiar to the Barbican in a sense. In a way, it's also like an inverted Centre Pompidou, where the circulations are not outside of the building, but kind of piercing through programmatic spaces, so that the urban space will kind of be brought into the house. And of course, the image we made of that, we produced for that new strip was during the blue hour. I don't know if you know the term blue hour. It's the densest time of the day, where day and night kind of they're equally present. It is the moment when everything seems to be possible also. Many great movies were shot during the blue hour. And you would see also the sports fields, which were kind of meant to be part of the school. They were just drawing on this boulevard, which then could be also overlapped by other activities. And the former schoolyard, where the existing school was, which will, when the school complex moves to the new strip, in the course of time become more and more liberated from the old buildings, yet the old buildings and their foundations would still be present as the only sealed surfaces in that park. It would be Zurich's largest public space, made of different layers of time, remnants, ruins, nature, equally present as the build. Kind of a vast public park, remaining open for new things to happen. Another park we did encounter actually a couple of months ago in Zurich last year was at Triemli, which is the city hospital of Zurich, the ZHAS. And I think those who attended the lecture of 8000 Agency, they heard about that competition. It was initiated partly by them, and that competition basically questioned the demolishing of the 3 towers of that hospital, of the Triemli.
At Triemli, every piece of ground is at the same time the roof of something else. Roof lights, ventilation shafts, embankments, parking entrances. There is a peculiarly ambiguous feel to the landscape surrounding the hospital buildings and the 3 towers. You see them down here? These are the 3 towers. Despite its modernist ambition of being a generous park, the space between the buildings turns out to be a merely thin green layer covering a monstrous basement, potentially combining all buildings on site. However, like organs without a body, none of these buildings establishes a true connection with the surrounding, depriving them of any sense of publicness and urbanity. This paradox becomes the project. We propose a continuous infrastructure connecting and activating existing below and above ground spaces. Beyond the binary understanding of inside and outside, the borders between city and landscape blur. So as we ponder the future of these three towers, we look beyond them. Linking what was formerly isolated is an operation which focuses on the space between buildings and existing rooms, a parameter generally ignored by those fetishizing the architectural object. Yet this negative space probably offers the greatest potential to transform the city hospital and its three towers into a living environment, a place of confrontation and non-canonization, allowing for a multitude of activities and encounters. A place open to the public and open to the city. This connecting infrastructure unveils a new type of urban landscape, which can be experienced as a continuous sequence of open and enclosed spaces, a specific and heterogeneous body composed of what was already there, once resting in pieces and now truly connecting the Triemli with the city of Zurich.
Did you recover from your trip?
I did, yeah, big time, thank you.
Okay. I can show you around.
That'd be great, thank you.
Qu'est-ce que tu fais là?
Try me.
We have a grand customer to you, being conservativiter, Mr. Speaker.
That's not true, Borst. I'm as adventurous as the next.
Your wife has an excellent palate, Mr. Speaker. It is always a pleasure for us to serve her.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.